Well, welcome back after the coffee break. We are now going to continue a little bit of discussion, but which was open in this morning session with some really good questions, and we will allow some space for discussion after a brief exchange of thoughts with the two guests which we have here. One is Petar Klepec, who is coming from Institute of Philosophy of Slovenian Academy for Sciences and Arts, who is basically dealing in his work with critique of ideology, so I think he will have really substantial things to say here. And Niccolo Milanese, whom you already saw here on the stage, who is founder of European Alternatives and many, many other organizations, media, etc., who will act here, let's say, since we have a session which is called How to Think and Act Left, let's say we have thinker and actor here. So we will try to use their expertise and see what kind of inspirational inputs they can give us for our further work here. Before I give the floor to them, I wrote down in this morning session two things which were really interesting for me, and I think they're important for our work further. First is Bessian. He said there is not much left on the left. Yes, I think. I think he said that, which is basically why we are all here today. And I think that is one of the key questions, how to gather not remainings of the left, but how to rebuild the left, and is it really the new left, or we just want to revive the old left? That is something we need to discuss basically in the further days. And the second thing I think Alma said it, we are here basically to translate this old theory into the practice. And I think that is also crucial, one of the crucial moments why we are here at Center for Advanced Studies, because we are somehow trying to combine the theory and the practice. We have here theoreticians, but we also have practitioners, and I think that is, from my point of view, that is a combination which is necessary and for producing something like platform which we are trying to produce. So I think these two moments are really highlights of this morning, at least for me. And since we have a small task in this panel to try to give inspirational input and also to try to observe regional and European perspectives, not only local here, and try to use them, I would just for the beginning give the floor to Petar to give his few foods for thought for us.
Thank you, Gazela. Thank you, everybody. First of all, I have to apologize myself for not giving you brief instructions about how to think and how to act. I realized that my intervention here has to have the form of an apology, because Felix mentioned earlier that the organizer is some kind of midwife, and this obviously hints into the direction of Socrates and his apology, etc. But nonetheless, as Lacan has said in one of his seminars, the problem with Socrates is that he's driven to suicide. So be careful, organizer, because at one point or another, there's a danger of suicide. Addressing you here is for me an easy task, because it's not what I normally do as a researcher or a professor, whatever. And I realized that this uneasiness is in a way very productive for me, because in a way I realized suddenly this morning that I'm not such an academician as I would like to be, because the question of left theory and practice is for me not an easy question. It is an uneasy question, I guess, for all of us here. And in that way, I realized that obviously I'm not speaking from the position of university discourse in the Lacanian sense of the word, which basically speaks from the position of a master. So what I will have here is just some sort of my quick associations and interventions into this morning discussion, instead of giving you an academician point of view, what's left, what's the new left today. So I realized when everybody was asked to introduce himself here that some of us has this uneasy feeling of saying who we are and what do we want to do here. And this question is obviously connected with the very form which was addressed to us. This is the form of interpellation, of question, from a position, what do you want here? And from psychoanalysis, we know that the question of what do you want is one of the most difficult, because it's connected with the desire. It's question que vuoi, and the desire is not an easy thing to deal with. And obviously, I'm not going into these problematics of desire and politics, and I'm not going to psychoanalyze too much. But obviously, this is also connected with what Niccolo was talking about question of minimum and maximum, and I will give some associations on that. You know, from a psychoanalytic point of view, the question of minimum is the question of what do you do not give up to. You know, do not give up your desires. One of the rare passages where Lacan speaks about it, and this is the question of the minimum. What is this minimum that you do not want to give up? And this obviously tackles also the question of the left, or what, as somebody said this morning, what's left of the left. And we could ramble around what is left and etc., etc. What is the new left? What is the left? And what's the difference between the new left with the capitals and the new left with the small new, etc., etc. But I won't go into that. The problem is also connected with this minimal questioning. This is also a very practical question for the left today. Is this only passive, reactive tactic, strategy? So we will just leave the enemy, whoever that is, to this point or not. So this is the question of no passaran, or whether the left as a political position is connected with some sort of a program. What do we want in the future to realize? Obviously, from the philosophical point of view, this is a question of orientation. And this is a big question which was already tackled by Kant. What means to orientate oneself? Heidegger and contemporary philosopher Badiou has taught a few cycles in his seminar. What does it mean to orient oneself? And this also tackles the question of minimum and maximum. For Badiou, the maximum is also communism, whatever that may be. And for everybody here, this question of maximum also tackles the problem of utopia, imagination, which is connected also to the problem of our political imagination and our desire as political beings. I won't risk any brief definitions of what is the minimum of everybody here, but let's say, for instance, for the sake of debate, that equality for all might be this minimum that we want all to address to. And this is the question that was addressed by Balibar, Barancière, etc., etc. So, Felix this morning also was addressing the question of why somebody who is connected to establishment, very 60s language and very new left language with a capital N, establishment, etc., why we would, let's say, be part of this process. And I think that the problem of any emancipatory politics today and with movements, etc., is also connected with this question of representation. Representation, which is a philosophical and political question. And it was summarized by Deleuze and Foucault in the 70s by problematizing the very notion of the universal. So whoever says somewhere, Deleuze, whoever says everybody thinks we are all for that is in a way lying and misrepresenting everybody. So this is the main question today: how to let's say, surpass this division between spontaneity, movements, this energy and will of the people to rebel, to resist, to revolve, to show, to manifest themselves, that they are not willing to give up to some political ideas, and the form of persistence which is linked to in politics, which is linked to the form of the party and which is linked to the form of a program. And this also addresses the question of our minimum and maximum here, because as I think that you spoke about what I want, what is my interest, and we have to come to the point what is our or what is yours, because I'm not part of this process maybe yet. So we have to, everybody here has to, in a way, and in politics it is such, has to surpass this division between what do I want and what do we want. So we, in this way, become some sort of political subject, which, in a way, comes together with demand in Laclauian sense of the word, because the politics for Laclau, as you know, begins with the clear expression of demand or political demand. So, the problem with discussing things and with brilliant ideas and everything is also the problem: when do we stop talking and when do we start acting? And it's a huge problem today, and I think that Senate in 2009 mentions this weird practice of English Parliament, which discussed for 700 hours question whether foxes can be hunted by dogs or not, and on the contrary, discussed for 18 hours question of the Supreme Court. So this is the one of the main problems today, is that on the one thing we have these brilliant ideas, everybody wants to express himself and everybody wants to share some thoughts, but as academicians, theoreticians, activists, etc., on one point we have to say, okay, I'm not agreeing with everything what everybody else says, but I'll stick to this political demand. And finally, this is my final association, this brings us to the question of the enemy, which is the question that was addressed by, how to put it correctly, which was addressed several times in the 20th century by ambiguous figure of Carl Schmitt versus his division between friend and enemy, and to say the least, which is some of the crucial questions today. And for instance, in Empire, Negri and Haar says, who is our enemy today? This is the political question. What I always, and this is my final thought, come to is that perhaps the division between right and left today should stick to what Frederick Jameson, as I suppose somewhere said, that the personification is not the right way to tackle the problem. So the right today, broadly speaking, maybe I'm just saying nonsense, but right today, most of the time, says the problem are wrong people on the right places, the problem are these and these people, the problem are this ethnic group, the problem are, I don't know, whatever. But the left should always, these problems link to the problem of the capitalist system as such. So the personification system division is in a way also the division between left and right. These are my associations for this morning so far. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Niccolo, what would you bring out as something which would be inspirational for you to give to these people?
Inspirational, I don't know, might be too much, but I think I have four things that I want to say, which starts a little bit with inspiration, because the question of imagination is the question of utopia and dreams, and to say something that's very, very simple. There's a distinction between somehow credible dreams and fantasies, right? I mean, in fantasies there's sometimes unicorns which are flying and other fantastic objects. In credible dreams, they're alternative futures, actually. And if we can, and that's what we need on the left. We need to have things that people can believe in, invest their imaginations in, but we need to show that they're credible. And of course, the back to the left, after the fall of communism and so on and so forth, is to recover this confidence, this credibility on the left. And it's why we should be clear and also take strength from the moments when academia, research, intellectual endeavour side with the left, because this is really a strong need on the leftist side. So I'm in favour of credible dreams, and also what a friend of mine, Tania Bruguera, the Cuban artist, has called practical utopias. She talks about practical utopias and the practice of what she calls artivism, which I don't find a particularly attractive word, but what she is getting at is that the artist has an essential role in helping citizens recover a potential of agency in their local environment. And so she sees the artist as someone who can help people realize practical utopias, and I think that this is somehow pointing in the right direction for us. That was the first relatively simple thing that I wanted to say. Perhaps combined with that, somehow based on these kinds of reflections, and to build on what Peter was saying about demands and Black Cloud, European Alternatives, we've used the slogan, imagine, demand, enact, to somehow show how we see what's both the progression and three aspects of every contemporary political action that you might carry out. Always needs to have this imaginative dimension, articulating a demand and somehow putting into action ourselves what it is we are claiming for. So that's the second point that I want to make, that I think that there is a marked shift throughout Europe, probably throughout the West more in general, in terms of the attitudes of the citizens towards political change, and very simply put, the citizens demanding to be involved in, to be helping to build, and helping to construct that change themselves. There's a strong rejection, for justified reasons I think, of what could be called social or political engineering coming from the top. So the role of the legislator is somehow put into crisis, but the counterpart of that is that the citizens are demanding to be highly involved in any social or political project. Some people have seen in the early stages of that movement, after 68 and so on, the possibility of the death of politics, right? That somehow society has taken the space that politics once occupied. I think that that's quite wrong, and one of the signs that that's quite wrong is that it is now very apparent to us. It's that there's a major battle about who is and who counts as civil society. This is now a major political question. And I think that you can see it just these last days. this major political question. And Sanya, before the break, was quite right to bring up the example of Macron, to bring up the example of Corbyn in the UK. Macron makes a big claim about his being a civil society movement, and in one sense he's correct. I mean, it's true that a large number of the candidates are not professional politicians, they are coming from the civil society, but which civil society is this? This is also the civil society of business, so it's somehow there's a Hegelian understanding of civil society also including private enterprise and profit-making enterprises as civil society. Whereas the civil society that might be supporting someone like Corbyn, right at the moment, is a very different civil society. It's the civil society that is contesting, that is acting in the streets, that is grassroots, or however it is you want to call it. So I think there's now a major battle about who is civil society, but one thing has been won, and that is that if you try to, if politicians or legislators try to suppress or ignore civil society, whoever that is, they're likely to lose power. Now, I think that this puts us in a problematic situation, and here the politics comes back in very strongly, because while there's a major battle about who is civil society and different civil society actors taking part in that, in domestic politics, international politics and international relations is still largely dominated by two actors: official political institutions and business corporations. So there is still some civil society involved in international relations, but it's almost entirely coming from corporations. And this at a time when international relations and anything that depasses the domestic sphere is more and more decisive for politics in general. And so I see as our task the opening up of this space for civil society and civic action on an international scale. Of course, taking inspiration, taking energy, building on the basis of moves towards civil society capturing power in the domestic sphere. That was the second thing that I wanted to say. Third thing, then about new left and the question of orientation. Because I've often had the impression that talking about new left and talking about what's the new meant to signify in the left, in the phrase new left. I've often had the impression, it might be misguided, but I've had the impression that the new left is meant to be a left after the evaporation of the future, after the disappearance of some idea of utopia, after the disappearance of some idea of direction, something to orientate oneself towards. And some people try to recuperate this, Badiou and the communist hypothesis and so on. I've never believed that's really going to work in the imaginations of the people, but I can see what he's trying to do. I think we need to recover a simple idea, which is immensely complicated to deal with, but it's orientation towards disalienation. This term of alienation and what it means to have an educated, intelligent, good life is something that the left has been afraid to address over recent years. And I think that this is something which reaches out, the question of what is a good life and what is a way of living and being able to live which is not highly alienated, is something which actually speaks to a larger and larger section of the population and reaches out beyond the kind of people who might usually be interested in the left. Final thing that I wanted to say, fourth thing, was about the question of strategy and the question of the idea of the good life. Just to actually clear up any potential misunderstanding I created earlier on, while one of the challenges of communication for the left is that it needs to make a distinction between its political strategy, which needs to be based on a calculation about its enemies, its friends, who to reach out to, who to try to influence, who to combat. But that is not its communication message. That's its strategy. It's what it's meant to be communicating is its ideals, which are not about friend and enemy. And just to try and be clear, I mean, all this Schmittian stuff, there may be a lot to be learned about, or from a strategic point of view, from reading Schmitt and Lenin. but from the point of view of articulating an idea of what world we want to create, this is a disaster. I mean, it seems really obvious, but a lot of leftist activists kind of forget it, and they bring all this stuff about friend-enemy into public discourse, and people quite rightly say, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So we have to be really clear about that. Those were the 4 things I wanted to say.
Thank you, Niccolo.
Can I just jump into? Sorry to reserve this position here, but just 3 remarks on your presentation, which are not against your presentation, but from a point of view of somebody who lived in ex-Yugoslavia, for instance. Perhaps. We are all getting here in a weird situation because we came from, how do we call it, from republics and places which previously belonged to the same cultural and political space. And what is frequently forgotten in these discussions today, contemporary European discussion, is our experience from ex-Yugoslavia, or from these times. First, about credible dreams and of shattering of these dreams. I mean, it's very notorious, this Jameson remark that today one can easily imagine the end of the world, but we cannot imagine the end of the capitalism. So, and one should be modest enough and to translate these terms into one can easily imagine, I don't know, do whatever, and instead of end of capitalism, we could just project whatever we want to some political demands, etc. And this is also linked to the question of utopia and what was lived here in these places in Yugoslavia. What is interesting also, this is just a remark, is this notion of civil society, which was in the 80s in Slovenia. This was perhaps the most frequently used signifier at all in this emancipatory politics. And when I was the editor at local student, radio student, I was once organizing the conference on these notions because we were together with the theoreticians and actors from that time, Paul Ganta, Tomasz Masnak, etc. We were trying to figure out why these notions suddenly disappeared when we entered the capitalism. And our experience from those times, so in the early 90s, was that this notion was somehow the rights stole it, you know. So the fight for hegemony was lost, and the question was why. And this is also the question you addressed to who is, which is also linked to the question what is political subject today. 99% multitude, people, whatever. So this points into this direction, and obviously I do strongly agree that this distinction between friend and enemy should be abandoned, but it's still operative today. So we have to have this strategy in a way, because from the psychoanalytical point of view, these common fights between Serbs and Croats, Slovenians and Croats, comes down to the problem of who is stealing us the enjoyment from, you know. So we are entitled to some sort of enjoyment, and there's also, all the time, there's this other who is preventing our identity, our way of life, etc., etc. So, and final remark concerning the notion of disalienation. In Slovenia, the transition from Marxist philosophy in the 60s to, as well as in Yugoslavia with the Praxis group, etc., and Heideggerians, etc., was strongly relying on this notion of alienation produced in Marx-Paris manuscripts, etc., etc. So, and at that time, there was a huge fight between Heideggerians and all other, let's say, dissidents. And there was obviously polemics regarding the question of authenticity, which is, in my view, for philosophy in 20th century, the most strongly linked with the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. And there was this polemics, Adorno, Heidegger, which is instructive, but in a way it's a little problematic, because they, in spite of their big differences, they agree on a lot of things. And the question of alienation and disalienation is really coming up in what some critics of modern, let's say, resistance or whatever movements call lifestyle activism. So this question should be addressed very cautiously. That's my. Okay.
Would you like to read?
I say two very quick things to complement what you just said, not to disagree. One thing that I wanted to mention is this phrase of what's left of the left, who's left. Of course, it's an important and worthwhile question, but shouldn't prevent us from claiming a history and a heritage of the left, or a heritage of resistance, or a heritage of however we want to phrase it, from throughout Europe. And of course, that history, like all histories, is also traumatic, has every kind of contradiction inside it, problem, and so on. And we shouldn't disown it either for that reason, or for the reason that the left somehow doesn't think it's entitled to a history that's always looking forward. That was one thing that I wanted to say. Second thing, on alienation, I think that this this debate, Heidegger, Adorno, Marx, Lukács, etc., is past. That has created two things. One is that it has been sort of recaptured under this debate about recognition, and very much about identity, bodily identity, gender identity, and so on and so forth. I think that's missing out a huge part of what is what was intended by alienation. It's an important element, but it's by no means everything about what does it mean to be living in a society in which you don't feel exploited, alienated, not living in an environment in which you feel alienated. And that, and because there's been a break with Marx, Heidegger, Lukács, etc., there's a possibility to rephrase or reframe these questions, not drawing so heavily on this particular heritage. I think that this particular heritage is an important one, but these questions were posed in other terms by other thinkers and writers. Think of the Romantics at other times, and now for me is the time to bring all of that heritage back in, to reframe this question about alienation and what is a good life.
I just want to keep a little bit of that notion of good life, which reminds me a lot of one Judith Butler's Livable Life, basically. Why do you think there is no pursuing good life as something which should be our vision in the leftist, if there are leftist movement for the moment? Why it's missing from the political spectrum for the moment? At least. Yeah, I'm trying. Why the notion of good life and what is good life is missing from political spectrum at all? And how do you believe that the left could pose it again?
It's
Well,
not
I'm
missing.
asking,
I
I'm
mean,
asking,
it's in
I'm
the
asking.
center of Badiou. La vraie vie, c'est ça.
Okay, from political spectrum in terms of political parties, why do you think that political parties are simply not focusing on how to achieve good life for the ordinary citizen? And that is the question which is connected actually to the thing that you said that citizens are demanding to be involved, to regain again control over the politics and everything. Are they really, in our region at least? Because we are facing a lot of, at least in elections which we had in the previous months, we are actually facing that citizens are abstaining from the politics, or they are voting for the option which are everything but not leftist options. So I also understand that there are no real leftist political options on the stage in this region, but still, why do you think how to revive this option and how to again offer the notion of good life in, at least in this region, although we had it in the history somehow, but obviously that history was very troublesome and...
I don't have the answer to your two questions, but one thing that for me would be an important part of the answer is to insist on what I tried to say about the disconnect between domestic political concerns and action and the international scene. And that because our lives, our imaginations, the way we represent ourselves, and that's a common thing to say, but still it seems to me to be true, are more than ever global, transnational, reaching beyond all kinds of boundaries, including political boundaries. And we don't find, up until now, ways of acting politically which match up to the scale of our lives. And until we do, there's always going to be good arguments to say, well, actually, what I do right here is not going to affect the major determining forces of my situation, and so why bother?
I mean, I just have an issue with that. I just have an issue with that because I think majority of people here who are coming from the activist field are actually grassroots initiatives, very local initiatives, which are trying to do something. And if we observe what you yesterday somebody mentioned, I think Eva, that the local front from Kraljevo, for example, can be a good example of action activities. And if we observe that level, which is very local but very close to the citizens, and maybe can much easier engage citizens, and this what you are saying, which is very international, and for many people, basically, do they care for that level, and how we make them care if you believe that that is the only way we can produce the change. Yeah.
I don't see the question in terms of these levels. The fact that something is local doesn't have to mean that it doesn't have embedded in it what you could quickly call universal claims, a vision of a world which goes beyond the question of what we do in this square in Zagreb. And so this is not the way to draw out the levels of politics. Nonetheless, I think that we have to be able to show the ways in which our local actions oriented towards a common universal horizon or a global outlook, where link up, create synergies, and create something bigger than local.